Have you ever felt it, that prickling sensation on the back of your neck? The feeling that someone is watching you. You turn around and there's nothing there. Just an empty room or a dark street, but the feeling does not go away. It stays with you, a cold knot in your stomach. You tell yourself it's just your imagination. You try to laugh it off, but you know, deep down, a small, frightened voice whispers that you are not alone. It tells you to run. It tells you to hide. It knows something you don't. This feeling is older than any story. It's a primal fear. The fear of what lurks just beyond the light of the campfire. The fear of what waits in the dark corners of your own home. Most of the time, it is nothing. Just the wind rattling a window pane, or the house settling in the night. But sometimes it's something else entirely. Something real. Something that means you harm. This is a story about one of those times. It happened to a young man named Leo, who learned that the most terrifying things are the ones you can't quite see. Leo lived in an old farmhouse, the kind with creaking floors and long dark hallways. He had lived there his whole life. He knew every groan of the old wood. He knew the sound of the wind as it howled around the eaves. He was not easily scared. But one night, that changed. He was in his room, reading a book. The only light came from a small lamp on his bedside table. The rest of the house was dark and silent. His parents were asleep down the hall. Everything was as it should be, or so he thought. That is when he felt it. A sudden, intense chill that had nothing to do with the temperature in the room. It was the feeling of being watched. He slowly lowered his book. His eyes scanned the shadows in the corners of his room. He saw nothing but familiar shapes, the outline of his dresser, the pile of clothes on a chair. He held his breath, listening. He heard only the faint ticking of a clock downstairs, but the feeling grew stronger. It felt like a pair of eyes were burning into the side of his face, watching his every move. Leo tried to ignore it. He told himself he was just tired. His mind was playing tricks on him. He picked up his book again, but honestly, the words on the page were a blur. He could not focus. The feeling was too powerful. It was a heavy weight pressing down on him, a sense of dread that coiled in his gut. It felt like something was standing just outside his door, waiting. He knew it was crazy. The door was closed. He had closed it himself before getting into bed. There was no one there. There couldn't be. He sat frozen for what felt like an hour. Every nerve in his body was screaming. He wanted to call out for his parents, but his throat was tight with fear. He could not make a sound. The silence in the house was no longer peaceful. It was heavy, threatening. It felt like the air before a storm. He strained his ears, listening for any sound, a footstep, a creak, anything to prove he was not just imagining things, but there was nothing. Only the suffocating silence and the terrible feeling of being watched by an unseen presence. Slowly, carefully, he turned his head. He looked toward the bedroom door. It was a plain wooden door, painted white. In the dim light from his lamp, it seemed to glow faintly against the darkness of the hallway beyond. He stared at it, his heart pounding against his ribs. He expected to see nothing, but he was wrong. At the bottom of the door, in the thin crack of space between the door and the floor, he saw a shadow. It was a thin dark line, the shadow of someone standing just on the other side. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through him. Someone was there, standing right outside his room. They were standing perfectly still, not making a sound, just waiting. Who was it? A burglar? Something worse? His mind raced, but he could find no logical explanation. His parents were asleep. The front door was locked. No one else should be in the house. The shadow did not move. It was just there, a silent, terrifying confirmation that his fear was real. He was not alone in the house, and whoever was out there was watching him. Leo stared at the sliver of shadow under his door. He did not dare to move. He barely dared to breathe. He thought that if he stayed still enough, quiet enough, the person on the other side might think he was asleep. They might go away. But the shadow remained, a dark, unmoving line, a silent testament to the intruder in his home. His room, once a place of safety and comfort, now felt like a trap. The walls seemed to be closing in on him. The darkness in the corner seemed to be reaching for him. Then he heard it, a sound so faint he thought he had imagined it, a soft scratching noise. It was coming from the door. It was a slow, deliberate sound, like a fingernail being dragged down the wood. Scratch, pause, it was a sound that sent ice-cold terror through his veins. This was not a burglar. A burglar would be quiet. A burglar would be trying to get in and out without being noticed. This was something else, something that wanted him to know it was there. It was toying with him. The scratching stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse. Leo's eyes were glued to the doorknob. He watched it, expecting it to turn at any moment. He imagined the door swinging open. He imagined a dark figure stepping into his room. He pulled the blankets up to his chin as if the thin fabric could protect him. Then the whispering began. It was low and raspy. It sounded like it was coming from all around him, from the walls themselves. It was not words he could understand, but the sound was full of malice. He squeezed his eyes shut. He put his hands over his ears, but he could still hear the whispers. He could still feel the presence in the house. He stayed like that, huddled under his blankets until the first light of dawn crept through his window. Only then did the whispers fade. Only then did the feeling of being watched finally go away. He waited until he could hear his parents moving around downstairs before he dared to open his door. The hallway was empty. There was no one there. But on the outside of his bedroom door were long, deep scratches in the paint. There are places in this world that feel wrong. Places where the air is heavy and the silence is loud. Old, forgotten roads are often like that. They are arteries of a time long past, paved with stories and secrets. Most people drive down them without a second thought. They're just a way to get from one place to another. But for some, these roads are more than just asphalt and dirt. They are a gateway to something else, something that should have been left undisturbed. This is a story about one such road and the two friends who drove down it one night. Their names were Sarah and Jessica. They were driving home late one night from a concert in a neighboring town. They decided to take a shortcut, a back road that cut through acres of dense forest and farmland. It was a road they had never taken before. The map on Sarah's phone said it would save them 20 minutes. As they turned off the well-lit highway onto the narrow country road, the world changed. The streetlights disappeared. The darkness on either side of the road was absolute. It was a thick, inky blackness that seemed to swallow the beams of their headlights. The road was old and poorly maintained. The asphalt cracked and uneven. Trees with long skeletal branches arched over the road, forming a dark tunnel. Sarah, who was driving, had to slow down. The car's headlights cut a lonely path through the oppressive darkness. Jessica nervously checked her phone. There was no signal. "This is creepy," she said, her voice a little shaky. "Maybe we should have stayed on the highway." Sarah tried to sound brave. "Don't worry," she said. "The map says we'll be back on the main road in 10 minutes. But the road seemed to go on forever. Every curve looked the same. Every stretch of dark woods felt endless. A thick fog began to roll in, clinging to the ground and swirling in their headlights. It made it even harder to see. Sarah leaned forward, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. The only sound was the hum of the engine and the crunch of gravel under the tires. The world outside their car felt alien and hostile. They were isolated, alone, and they both had the growing, terrible feeling that they were not welcome here. Suddenly, the car's engine sputtered. It coughed once, twice, and then died. The headlights flickered and went out. Sarah and Jessica were plunged into almost total darkness. The only light came from the faint glow of the dashboard. Sarah tried to restart the car. She turned the key again and again, but the engine just made a weak clicking sound. "No, no, no," she whispered, her voice filled with panic. "This can't be happening." They were stranded, in the middle of nowhere, on a dark, foggy road with no cell signal. Jessica fumbled in the glove compartment and found a small flashlight. She switched it on. Its weak beam cut a small circle in the suffocating darkness. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice trembling. "We can't just sit here." Sarah took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "Okay," she said. "Let's just wait a few minutes. Maybe it will start again." But they both knew it was a false hope. The car was dead. They were miles from the nearest town, and the woods around them were silent. Too silent. That is when they heard it, a voice. It came from the darkness outside the car. It was a man's voice, and it was singing. It was an old, haunting melody, a nursery rhyme. But the voice was distorted, wrong. It sounded like it was coming from an old, broken radio. It was faint at first, then it grew louder. It seemed to be coming from somewhere down the road in the direction they had been heading. The singing was slow and drawn out. It was a sound that made the hair on their arms stand on end. Sarah quickly locked the car doors. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. Jessica shone the flashlight out the window, but the beam was swallowed by the thick fog. They could see nothing, but the singing continued. It was getting closer. They could hear footsteps now, a slow, shuffling sound. Someone was walking toward them on the empty road, walking through the fog, singing that terrible, childish song. They were trapped in the car, a metal box in the middle of a nightmare. The singing grew louder and louder. It was right outside the car now. The two girls huddled together in the front seat, too scared to even speak. The shuffling footsteps stopped right beside the driver's side door. The singing stopped. An awful, heavy silence fell over the car. Sarah and Jessica held their breath. They stared at the driver's side window, expecting to see a face pressed against the glass, but there was nothing, just the thick white fog. Then a tapping sound began on the roof of the car. Tap, tap, tap. It was a slow, rhythmic sound, like someone was drumming their fingers on the metal. It was a playful sound, a curious sound, but it was the most terrifying thing they had ever heard. The tapping moved from the roof to the window, tap, 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 right next to Sarah's head. She let out a small, choked sob. Jessica frantically tried the car's ignition again. By some miracle, the engine roared to life. The headlights flashed on, cutting through the fog. In the sudden, blinding light, they saw it. For just a second, it was a tall, thin figure standing by the side of the road. It was hunched over, with arms that were too long. It had no face, just a smooth, pale expanse of skin where its features should have been. As the headlights hit it, it recoiled, scurrying back into the darkness of the woods with an unnatural speed. It moved like an insect, a spider. It was there, and then it was gone. But the image of it was burned into their minds. Sarah did not hesitate. She slammed her foot on the gas pedal. The tires screeched on the wet asphalt as the car lurched forward. She did not slow down. She drove as fast as she could, her eyes wide with terror. She did not look in the rearview mirror. She did not want to know if the figure was following them. They drove in silence, the only sound the pounding of their own hearts. After what felt like an eternity, they saw the warm, welcoming lights of the main highway up ahead. They had escaped. They never spoke about what happened on that road, not to each other, not to anyone else. How could they? Who would believe them? They had seen something that should not exist, something that defied all logic and reason. They had stumbled into a place where the rules of the world did not apply, and they had been lucky to get out alive. But the memory of that night never left them. It lingered in the back of their minds, a dark shadow that would surface in the quiet moments before sleep. Sometimes late at night, Sarah would hear a faint tapping sound. She would tell herself it was just the house settling or a branch brushing against the window, but she knew what it really was. It was the memory of the figure on the road, the figure with no face and arms that were too long, and Jessica would sometimes wake up in a cold sweat, the sound of a distorted nursery rhyme echoing in her ears. The road had left its mark on them, a scar that no one else could see. These stories are different, but they share a common thread. They are about what happens when the ordinary world peels back, just for a moment, to reveal the terrifying darkness that lies beneath. They are about the fear of the unknown, the fear of what waits for us in the dark. Leo never found out who or what was outside his door that night, and Sarah and Jessica never went back to find out what was waiting for them in the fog. Some questions are better left unanswered, some doors are better left unopened, because the world is full of shadows, and sometimes those shadows reach out for us. They whisper to us from our walls. They sing to us on lonely roads. They remind us that we are not as safe as we think we are. They remind us that the night is old and full of terrors that have no name. And the most frightening part is that these things are real.
Have you ever laid in bed in the dead of night and heard a sound that just didn't belong? A floorboard creaking upstairs when you're home alone, or a faint whisper that seems to ride on the very edge of the silence? It's a primal feeling. That jolt of adrenaline that reminds you how vulnerable you are when the sun goes down. The night has a way of transforming the familiar into the menacing. That chair in the corner of your room? Suddenly, it's not just a chair anymore. Its shadow stretches and twists into something vaguely human. The gentle rustle of leaves outside your window becomes the deliberate footsteps of someone, or something, lurking just beyond your sight. These aren't just tricks of an overactive imagination. For most of us, these moments pass, dismissed as the house settling or the wind playing tricks. We pull the covers up a little higher, our heart rate eventually slows, and we drift off to sleep, safe in our cocoons of denial. But what about the times when it's not just the wind? What happens when the noise doesn't stop, when the shadow doesn't retreat, and the sense of being watched becomes an undeniable certainty? When the thin veil between our safe reality and the terrifying unknown is ripped away, leaving you face to face with the true horror that walks in the darkness. Today, we're going to delve into 3 stories from people who experienced just that. These are not tales from a campfire, they are real, harrowing accounts of what can happen when the night decides to show you its true face. These individuals stared into the abyss of the unseen hours and found something staring back. So turn down the lights, get comfortable, and prepare to hear about the chilling reality that unfolds when the rest of the world is asleep. But be warned, after hearing these stories, you might not look at the darkness the same way again. Our first story comes from a woman named Clara, who was living alone in a small, cozy bungalow on the outskirts of a quiet town in rural Ohio. It was the kind of place where everybody knew everybody, and locking your doors was more of a suggestion than a necessity. Clara loved the peace and quiet, the feeling of being nestled away from the hustle and bustle of city life. But one Tuesday night in late autumn, that sense of security would be shattered forever. It was just after midnight, and a fierce storm was raging outside. Rain lashed against the windows in sheets, and the wind howled like a wounded animal. Clara was curled up on her sofa, reading a book, with only a single lamp casting a warm, golden glow in the living room. The rhythmic drumming of the rain and the occasional rumble of distant thunder were actually quite comforting to her, a perfect soundtrack for a quiet night in. Suddenly, over the din of the storm, she heard it, a sound that was sharp, deliberate, and completely out of place. 3 loud, forceful knocks on her front door. Clara's heart leaped into her throat. Who on earth would be out in this weather at this hour? Her first thought was that maybe a neighbor was in trouble. Perhaps their power had gone out or they had an emergency. She placed her bookmark carefully in her novel and set it aside. She padded over to the front door, her bare feet cold on the hardwood floor. The knocking came again, this time more insistent, louder. Bam, bam, bam. A shiver that had nothing to do with the cold ran down her spine. She peered through the peephole, but all she could see was a distorted, watery view of her porch light, blurred by the sheets of rain streaming down the lens. There was no clear figure, just a vague, dark shape standing on her porch. "Who is it?" she called out, her voice trembling slightly. She tried to make it sound firm, but the fear was already creeping in. The only response was silence, broken only by the relentless storm. A minute passed, then 2. Clara began to think maybe she had imagined it, or that whoever it was had given up and left. She pressed her eye to the peephole again. The dark shape was still there, motionless. Then a voice, low and raspy, cut through the noise of the wind and rain. "Let me in." It wasn't a plea, it was a command. The voice was deep, gravelly, and it seemed to come from right beside the door, as if the person was pressing their face against the wood. Every instinct in Clara's body screamed at her not to open that door. This was not a neighbor in need, this was something else entirely. "I can't do that," she managed to say, her voice barely a whisper. "Who are you? What do you want?" Again there was only silence from the other side. Clara backed away from the door slowly, her eyes wide with terror. She fumbled for her phone on the coffee table, her hands shaking so badly she could barely grip it. She needed to call the police. This was no longer just strange, it was terrifying. As her fingers hovered over the numbers 911, the doorknob began to jiggle. Slowly at first, then more violently. It was being twisted back and forth, the old metal groaning in protest. Clara froze, phone in hand, listening to the metallic rattle that seemed to echo the frantic beating of her own heart. The person outside was actively trying to get into her house. She finally snapped out of her paralysis and quickly dialed 911. As she whispered her address to the dispatcher, her eyes remained glued to the front door. The rattling stopped. For a terrifying moment there was an unnerving calm. Clara held her breath, straining to hear anything over the storm and the voice of the dispatcher in her ear. Then came a new sound, a scraping noise. It was coming from the side of the house near the living room window. Clara crept towards the window, her phone clutched to her chest like a talisman. She pulled back the curtain just a fraction of an inch, her heart pounding against her ribs. What she saw made the blood run cold in her veins. A man was standing there, his back to the window, methodically running a long, thin object. It looked like a crowbar, along the window frame, testing for a weak spot. He was tall and gaunt, dressed in dark, rain-soaked clothes. He hadn't seen her, he was completely focused on his task, on finding a way into her sanctuary. Clara let the curtain fall and scrambled backwards, stumbling over an ottoman and landing hard on the floor. She stayed on the line with the dispatcher, her whispers now frantic and desperate, explaining that the man was trying to break in through the window. The dispatcher assured her that officers were on their way, their sirens cutting through the storm, but to Clara, they sounded a lifetime away. The scraping stopped. It was replaced by a sharp crack as the wood of the window frame splintered. Then another, louder crack. He was making progress. He was getting in. Clara, now hiding behind the sofa, felt utterly helpless. This was her home, her safe space, and it was being violated by a complete stranger with violent intentions. She could hear him grunting with effort, the sounds punctuated by the splintering of wood. The dispatcher was trying to keep her calm, telling her to stay hidden and quiet, but how could she be calm when a monster was tearing his way into her living room? Each sound was a countdown to a confrontation she was certain she wouldn't survive. Just as a loud crash signaled the window pane giving way, she heard it. A different sound cutting through the night. The wail of sirens, faint at first, but growing louder and closer with each passing second. The man outside must have heard it too, because the sounds of his break-in attempt ceased immediately. Clara risked another peek over the top of the sofa. The man was gone. The broken window stood as a gaping wound in the side of her house, letting in the wind and the rain, but the immediate threat had vanished. A few moments later, powerful beams of light swept across her living room as 2 police cars skidded to a halt in her driveway. The police searched the area thoroughly, but the man was gone, swallowed by the storm and the darkness. They never found him. They took Clara's statement, boarded up her broken window, and advised her to install a better security system. Clara did more than that. She sold the house a month later, unable to shake the feeling of being watched, unable to ever feel safe there again. The memory of the raspy voice and the rattling doorknob became a permanent part of her nightmares. Our next account takes us to the dense forests of the Pacific Northwest, a region known for its towering trees and deep primordial wilderness. The story comes from a young man named Ethan, an avid hiker and amateur photographer who often sought solace in nature. He had hiked dozens of trails, both day and night, and considered the woods his second home. He was comfortable with the sounds of the forest after dark, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of a small animal. But one night, the forest would speak to him in a way he never imagined. Ethan had decided to do a short, familiar night hike to capture some long exposure shots of the stars. It was a clear, moonless night, and the trail he chose was a simple 3-mile loop he had walked countless times. He set off around 10 p.m., equipped with a powerful headlamp, his camera gear, and a sense of calm anticipation. The air was cool and crisp, and the familiar scent of pine and damp earth filled his lungs. For the first hour, everything was perfectly normal. The beam of his headlamp cut a path through the inky blackness, illuminating the trail ahead. The silence of the deep woods was profound, a comforting blanket that Ethan cherished. He found a small clearing, set up his tripod, and began taking pictures, marveling at the sheer number of stars visible away from the city lights. It was as he was packing up his gear to head back that he first heard it. It was a whisper, faint and indistinct, seemingly coming from the dense thicket of ferns to his left. He froze, turning his head to listen more intently. He switched off his headlamp, plunging himself into near-total darkness, hoping to hear it more clearly. The whispering continued, a soft, sibilant sound like multiple people talking just at the edge of his hearing. Ethan's rational mind immediately tried to explain it away. It was the wind rustling the leaves, he told himself. Or maybe the sound of a nearby creek he hadn't noticed before. But the longer he listened, the more convinced he became that this was no natural sound. It had a cadence, a rhythm, that sounded distinctly like speech, even though he couldn't make out any specific words. A prickle of unease started to crawl up his spine. He switched his headlamp back on, its powerful beam slicing through the darkness, and scanned the area. The beam swept across ancient trees, moss-covered rocks, and thick undergrowth. There was nothing there. No animals, no people, just the forest. Yet, the whispering persisted, seeming to ebb and flow, sometimes sounding closer, sometimes farther away. He decided to pack up quickly and get back to his car. The peaceful solitude he had been enjoying was rapidly evaporating, replaced by a growing sense of dread. As he started back down the trail, the whispering seemed to follow him. It was always just off to his side, in the impenetrable darkness beyond the reach of his headlamp. He picked up his pace, his heart beginning to thud against his ribs. The familiar friendly woods now felt alien and menacing. Every shadow seemed to stretch and writhe, and every snapped twig under his boots sounded like a gunshot in the oppressive silence. He kept glancing over his shoulder, sweeping the beam of his light into the trees, but he never saw anything. Still, the whispering was a constant companion. It was maddening. It felt like he was being stalked by something he couldn't see, something that was deliberately staying just out of sight, tormenting him with its unintelligible murmurs. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming. Then, for a moment, the whispering stopped. Ethan halted on the trail, straining his ears. The sudden, absolute silence was somehow even more terrifying than the noise had been. He stood motionless for what felt like an eternity, every nerve in his body on high alert. He scanned the darkness around him, his headlamp beam cutting frantic arcs through the trees. And that's when he saw them. For just a split second, at the absolute edge of his headlamp's range, he caught a glimpse of movement. It wasn't one thing, but several. Tall, unnaturally thin figures darting between the trees. They were dark, silhouetted against the slightly less dark forest, and they moved with a fluid, jerky grace that was utterly inhuman. He couldn't make out any features, just their spindly, elongated shapes. A gasp escaped his lips and he stumbled backward. His mind reeled. What had he just seen? Were they people? Animals? His brain couldn't process the fleeting, nightmarish image. The whispering started again, but this time it was different. It was louder, closer, and it seemed to be coming from all directions at once. It was a cacophony of hushed, overlapping voices, a sound that seemed to claw at the inside of his skull. That was it. Pure, unadulterated terror took over. Ethan didn't wait to see the figures again. He turned and ran. He sprinted down the trail, heedless of the rocks and roots that threatened to trip him. The beam of his headlamp bounced wildly, creating a dizzying, strobe-like effect. The whispering surged around him, a roaring in his ears that drowned out the sound of his own panicked breathing and pounding feet. He felt like he was running through a nightmare, chased by phantoms he couldn't comprehend. The woods, his sanctuary, had become a labyrinth of fear. He didn't dare look back. He just focused on the small patch of illuminated trail in front of him, praying he wouldn't fall. The 3/4 of a mile back to the trailhead felt like 100. Finally, he burst out of the tree line and into the gravel parking lot. The sight of his car, solid and real under the faint starlight, was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. He fumbled with his keys, his hands shaking uncontrollably, and practically threw himself inside, locking the doors with a loud thud. He sat there for a moment, chest heaving, listening. The whispering was gone. The only sound was his own ragged breathing and the ticking of the engine as it cooled. He stared back at the dark, silent wall of trees from which he had just emerged. It looked as peaceful and inert as it always had. Had he imagined it all? The whispers, the impossibly tall figures, but the terror he felt was real. The scratches on his arms from running through the undergrowth were real. Ethan started the car and sped away from the forest, not looking back. He never hiked that trail again, day or night. He still loves the outdoors, but a part of him is now forever wary of the deep woods after dark. He knows that some places hold secrets, and that sometimes when you listen closely in the silence of the forest, you might hear it whispering back, and you will not like what it has to say. Our final story is, perhaps the most personal and unsettling, since it takes place not in some remote location, but right within the supposed safety of one's own home. This is the story of a man named Mark, who, along with his wife Anna, moved into what they thought was their dream house, a charming 2-story colonial in a quiet suburban neighborhood. For the first few months, life was, honestly, perfect. But then, the nights began to change. It started out subtly. Mark was a bit of a night owl, you know, and would often stay up later than Anna, reading or watching TV downstairs. One night, as he was heading up to bed around 2 in the morning, he saw something out of the corner of his eye. At the far end of the upstairs hallway, for just a fraction of a second, he thought he saw a shadow detach itself from the other shadows and melt into the wall. He blinked, shook his head, and just dismissed it as fatigue. His eyes were, he figured, playing tricks on him. But then, a week later, it happened again. This time, he was coming out of the bathroom in the middle of the night. As his eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering in from the streetlights outside, he saw it more clearly. It was a tall, man-shaped shadow, standing perfectly still at the end of the hall, near the guest bedroom. It was darker than the surrounding shadows, a void in the dimness. Mark just stared at it, his heart starting to hammer. It wasn't a trick of the light, it was a definite shape. He flicked on the hallway light switch, and just like that, it was gone. The hallway was empty, just a plain carpeted corridor with doors leading to the various rooms. He felt a chill crawl over his skin. He checked the guest room, the master bedroom where Anna was sound asleep, and his daughter's room. Everything was normal. He tried to rationalize it, to convince himself it was some strange optical illusion caused by the specific angle of the moonlight. But the sightings became more frequent. Almost every night that he was up late, he would see it. The shadow in the hallway. It never moved. It never made a sound. It just stood there, watching. Mark started to grow deeply unsettled. He began to dread going upstairs after Anna had gone to bed. The hallway, once just a simple passage in his home, had become a place of immense fear. He tried to tell Anna about it, but, well, he felt foolish. How do you tell your wife you're being haunted by a shadow? She would think he was losing his mind, or just not getting enough sleep, so he kept it to himself, and the secret gnawed at him. His anxiety grew. He started leaving the hallway light on all night, much to Anna's confusion, telling her he kept tripping in the dark. One night, the phenomenon escalated. Mark was in bed, trying to fall asleep, but his mind was racing. He kept picturing the shadow standing out there in the hall. Finally, unable to take it anymore, he quietly got out of bed to go check. He opened his bedroom door a crack and peered out. The hallway light was on, as he'd left it, and the hall was empty. He felt a wave of relief wash over him. Maybe tonight it was gone. He started to close the door, but then he froze. His eyes were drawn to the sliver of darkness under the door of the guest bedroom, directly across the hall. From within that sliver of darkness, he saw movement. A shadow passed by the bottom of the door, from one side to the other. Someone, or something, was inside the guest room. The guest room that was supposed to be empty. Mark's blood turned to ice. Every horror movie trope, every ghost story he'd ever heard, just flooded his mind. This was no longer just a passive shadow in the hall. It was inside a room, his house. He slowly, silently, closed his bedroom door and locked it. He stood with his back against it, listening, his body trembling. He didn't know what to do. Wake up Anna? Call the police? What would he even say? There's a shadow in my guest room? He stood there for what felt like hours, listening to the frantic beating of his own heart. He heard nothing from the hallway. No footsteps, no creaks, no sounds at all. The silence was absolute and terrifying. Eventually, sheer exhaustion began to overtake his fear. He crept back into bed, but he didn't sleep. He just lay there, staring at his locked bedroom door, until the first rays of dawn crept through the blinds. The next day, Mark knew he had to do something. The fear was becoming unbearable. He decided he had to confront whatever was in the guest room. With the sun shining brightly and Anna downstairs making breakfast, he felt braver. He walked down the hall, his heart pounding, and stood before the guest room door. He took a deep breath, turned the knob, and pushed it open. The room was pristine. The bed was neatly made, the curtains were drawn, letting in the cheerful morning light. There was nothing out of place. He checked the closet. Empty. He looked under the bed. Nothing. He felt a strange mix of relief and utter confusion. Had he imagined the whole thing? Was he finally cracking under the stress? He was about to leave the room when he noticed something on the floor, near the window. It was a small, dusty footprint on the hardwood, partially obscured by the rug, and leading from the window was a set of faint, dirty scuff marks. His eyes followed them across the room, to the closet, and then to the door leading into the hallway. Then he looked up at the window. The lock was broken. The realization hit him like a physical blow. This wasn't a ghost, it wasn't a paranormal entity, it was something far, far worse. Someone had been breaking into his house. Someone had been living in his guest room, possibly for weeks, hiding in the closet during the day and at night. At night, they would stand in the hallway, watching his family. The shadow he had seen wasn't a specter, it was a man who had been standing in the darkness of his home, just feet from where his wife and child slept. The terror Mark felt now was 1,000 times worse than any fear of the supernatural. This was real. This was a tangible human threat that had been inside his sanctuary all along. He ran downstairs, yelled for Anna to grab their daughter and get out of the house, and called the police. The investigation revealed a chilling story. A homeless man who had been squatting in vacant houses in the area had found their guest room window easy to jimmy open. He had been using their house for shelter, coming and going at night, taking small amounts of food from the kitchen. The police found a small nest of blankets and stolen food wrappers in the back of the guest room closet. The man was never caught. Mark and his family moved out within the week, unable to ever feel safe in that house again, forever haunted by the knowledge of the living shadow that had watched them in the night. The night holds a unique power over us. It's a time for rest and dreams, but as these stories show, it can also be a curtain for horrors we can barely comprehend. For Clara, the sound of rain against a window will forever be tied to the terror of a stranger trying to force his way in. For Ethan, the peaceful silence of the woods is now filled with the echo of unseen whispers and the memory of figures that defied explanation. And for Mark, the safety of his own home was revealed to be a terrifying illusion, hiding a threat far more real and insidious than any ghost. These accounts remind us that our sense of security is often fragile, and that the darkness can conceal dangers both from this world and maybe from somewhere else. These aren't just stories to scare you. They are stark reminders of the vulnerability we all share when the sun goes down. They speak to a primal fear that's etched into our DNA. The fear of the unknown that lurks just beyond the firelight, just outside our window, or even down the hall. We build walls and lock our doors to keep the night at bay, but sometimes the darkness finds a way in. It serves as a chilling testament to the fact that we are never truly alone in the dark, and we can never be entirely sure of what's watching us from the shadows. So the next time you hear an unexplained noise in the middle of the night, or see a shadow that seems a little too dark, a little too still, maybe don't be so quick to dismiss it.